brought in a lot. You actually talk about reconciliation. And most of us are familiar with our reconciliation with God. But you delve down deeper and you actually mention 4 reconciliations. And identify 4 parts. First one is the reconciliation of race, Jew and Gentile, gender, husbands and wives, class, slave and free, and age, children and parents. And that's all found in Ephesians. And that comprises the second greatest commandment, which is to love your neighbor. And you mentioned the horizontal reconciliation is merely reflection of the greater vertical reconciliation of sinners to God, the greatest commandment, Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. Why is it so important to discuss these other reconciliations? Because I know of some evangelicals that say, hey, we're just to be reconciled with God. All this racial stuff, class stuff really isn't the gospel. It's actually a hindrance. Just let us evangelize and tell people about Jesus. How do you respond to that?
Right. This is great. Race, class, age, and gender are not only found in Ephesians, but also in Colossians and Galatians. So Paul actually talks about these categories in 3 different epistles. So you got to be like, okay, sit up and pay attention, right? Because he keeps on repeating this. So it's not just one time. The other thing is that diversity is part of the beauty of the body of God. I often tell people that this is one of the greatest apologetics for Christianity, the fact that we are the most diverse and geographically widespread religion on earth. So this is why polycentrism is important, because unlike most other religions, which have, a holy city, Mecca, Varanasi, Salt Lake City, what have you, we don't. There is no center to Christianity. No geographic center, no ethnic majority. All right, we are of every country, nationality, ethnicity, continents till spread. So, and so the reason why this is such a great apologetic is, like, if there really is a global God, don't you think he would be worshipped by like every people on earth rather than by just one ethnic group or one geographic area on earth, right? So most other religions are just one ethnic group or one geographical area on earth. So that's the argument for race. And also in Revelation 7:9, every tribe, tongue, nation is worshiping around the throne. And so when you get to heaven, actually, we're still going to retain our ethnicity, our nationality, our language, our culture. Yeah, because that glorifies God when all this diversity is around the throne. So, but also the reconciliation of age, gender, and social class. I often tell people this is the difference between a church and a parachurch. A parachurch targets one demographic. So you have like Campus Crusade, right, which targets university students. You have Jews for Jesus, which targets Jews. Whatever the OMF, which targets China, right? So all of these parachurch organizations aim for a particular demographic, but when you have the church, it should cover all. It should, I used to talk to college students who are like part of Cru or IB, and they're like, oh, I don't need to go to church because this is like my church, right? I'm like, why? They're like, well, because, we have worship, we have prayer, we have evangelism, we have fellowship, like, we have a sermon. So it's church, right? And I'm like, my answer to them is church is not comprised of exclusively 18 to 21-year-olds who are middle to upper middle class, who have an IQ of over 120, who leave after 4 years. I'm like, that's not church. Okay? Church is much more diverse, where older and younger generations come together, different races come together, different social classes, and men and women. And so we need to have this beautiful diversity in the body. And okay, that's the encouragement. Now I'm going to put the fear. Okay, so the parable of the unmerciful servant. Jesus says, okay, remember, he's like, the master forgave the servant his debt. And then that servant goes and refuses to forgive the debt of another servant. So the master hears about this and goes to the first servant and says, you wicked servant, right? Like, you clearly don't understand what I did for you. And he throws the guy in jail, weeping and gnashing of teeth, right? So I think this is instructive for us. The love of God, this is the master of the first servant. This is us, right? He's like, I have loved you with an unconditional, redeeming love that knows no bounds. Now go and love your neighbor who's different from you. The neighbor, as Jesus defined it in the parable of the Good Samaritan, to the Jew, the Samaritan was like the dirty one, the other person with the wrong ethnicity, the wrong religion, the wrong everything, right? And Jesus says to the Jew, yeah, that's your neighbor. That's the person you got to love. So, you know, if you were put this into modern day, you would say the parable of the, you know, if you're talking to a Korean, it would be like the parable of the good Japanese. If you're talking to a Tutsi in Rwanda, it would be the parable of the good Hutu. Talking to a Jew in World War II, the parable of the good Nazi. Talking to an American, it would be the parable of the good Al-Qaeda. Okay, so feel the force of that, right? That is what Jesus wants us to do. So going back to the parable of the unmerciful servant, God says, I have loved you and redeemed you and forgiven you. Now you go reconcile with your neighbor who's different from you, different social class, different age, different ethnicity, different gender, different everything. And we're like, we can't do it. Then what's the lesson? God's like, I'm not going to do it for you then. Because you clearly don't understand what I just did for you. It's like, whoa, right? Like that is forceful. We even pray this in the Lord's Prayer. I'm like, if you've ever prayed the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we have forgiven those who trespass against us, or depending on your translation, forgive us our sins as we have forgiven those who have sinned against us. The condition is as we have forgiven others. God, do that to me. It's the reverse golden rule, kind of, right? It's like, as we have forgiven others. So I have to stop and think, how have I forgiven others? How have I treated others? How have I loved others? Because whatever measure I've used, that's the measure God's going to use for me. So if the encouragement doesn't work, then I'm like, use the fear, man.